Hey everyone, a while back there was a thread on Reddit about what the most overrated FE unit was, and I thought it'd be interesting to go over them to see if the arguments hold up and to see if I actually think the units are overrated or if they're good at all. Those are two different things, of course. And also to see just how toxic the discussion would get, because Fire Emblem has a reputation of having a somewhat elitist, goalkeepist fandom sometimes, and I thought, this would be a good opportunity for that to come out and see it in the wild. So let's go over it. First post. I think it's hard to give an answer to this that isn't kind of annoying. Some units that are fairly well understood to be lacking by efficiency players will never tarnish their broader rep and will continue to be overrated. That is true, but not very interesting. At the same time, it's either that or take a swing at a good unit, which is extremely hard to do and requires good evidence and argumentation, so I got nothing. End quote for now. So this is more of a meta answer than talking about an actual unit, but I still think it is interesting. Broadly, I think I agree. For a lot of units, you can't really argue as a YouTuber or as a player who's been in the fandom for a while. You can't really argue a unit's reputation away because the impressions that the games leave on a unit tend to be almost universal. Of course, everyone's playstyles are different and people's level ups will be different, so not every player is going to have the same experience, but a lot of units tend to get similar reputations from different players playing the same game in similar-ish, different-ish ways. And I think a good example of this is Kliff, for example. A lot of experienced players have online made arguments as to why Kliff is not just decent, but actually good. But still, a lot of players come out of Shadows of Valentia with the same idea: Kliff is shit. They hate Kliff, and they prefer using Matilda for several reasons. Some people come out liking Matilda less than Kliff, but generally this is the trend and experience. And I don't think my waifu video did a great job of converting people because it does rely on a lot of meta knowledge, a lot of strats, a lot of specific resource uses that I do think are not just optimal, but also will just make the game easier for you if you follow the guidelines in there. But a lot of people will never see that video, a lot of people will never agree with it. People are less inclined to do things if they don't think they're a good idea, if they don't match up with what they think they want to do, and that's completely fine. It's just advice, it doesn't really matter to me. But if you're talking about a tier list and you put like Kliff at the top and Matilda in the middle somewhere, people are going to get a little bit, they're going to be like, why is that the case? You could explain it like 100 times and some people will still just disagree, even though I don't think they have a good argument. So I agree on this. Sometimes a online argument will penetrate the larger fandom as a whole and actually make a difference for a unit's reputation. I'm not sure there's a unit that really goes for it, because a lot of likely candidates like, I don't know, Lynn, still kind of has the same reputation among newer players. Like, yeah, she dodges everything, she crits a lot. That's technically true, so it's hard to make people see why Lynn is bad unless they really analyze Fire Emblem on a slightly deeper level. And a lot of people will just not do that, and again, that is okay. I think Gareth might be a good example of a unit that is slightly better understood to be, I don't know about good, I wouldn't call him good, but I see less people saying like, yeah, Gareth is awful, all the enemies around him are like based on res stuff. I still see it like every now and then, but how often do you even see people talk about Gareth? So I think overall this is a true take from this first poster. Now the specific unit mentioned in this comment is Na. How about Na? Awakening kids are somewhat overrated by default. She has debatably the worst class set and mods, and due to uneven numbers, she should probably be left unmarried and unemployed, even for apotheosis, giving her no real niche other than using her because you like her. And this is fair enough. Again, I think a lot of people who use Awakening kids will probably just come off their first playthroughs like, yeah, now was super good for me, so were the other kids, because, they end up good, so it's easy. You don't really need to do a whole lot of analysis to figure that out. Like, the unit kills everything, especially for Na, a unit that's not only just killing things, but doing so at 1 or 2 range, and her stat screen is always just hilarious at the end of the game. When you have a Manakete, they're going to not just have really high stats on the left side of the stat screen, but also there's going to be a bunch of plus 10s or whatever, a bunch of plus green numbers, plus para bonuses and everything else. And we can actually look different, but you get the point, right? It's not just good stat, it's good stat plus another good high number. it works out really well to giving you a vibe of, okay, I'm killing everything by big numbers. And yeah, I think this is it's a really good example. It's probably, if you see it that way, that she looks better than all the other characters because of those numbers, then she's probably also the most overrated of the Awakening kids, and also she's probably one of the worst ones. It's been a while since I looked into Awakening meta, let alone kids meta, but I think this holds up. So yeah, sure. Of course, when we're talking about overrated and underrated, there's different layers of fandom with different perceptions. Like I just talked about how the really broad fandom, like people just play the game once and maybe go online a little bit to talk about their favorite unit, that's it. That's already a level of engagement that a lot of people will never get to. Some people will just play the games, and some people will play the games to go online and stay in the community, and some people will really get into it. They might even one day subscribe to my channel and they'll leave a comment or something. All those are different layers of like how deep people will engage with it, and different layers will have different ideas of how good certain units are. I'm sure my fans have different ideas of what units are good than any other FVTuber. And again, that is perfectly okay, but it does make it hard to make broad statements on what fans as a whole are overrating and underrating. I've always said that people sometimes say this unit is overrated when it's just people in their circle saying that, or it's just people that it's just like them assuming what people think, or people making assumptions based on what people 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago used to think. Reminder that some Fire Emblem games are really freaking old. So it is really hard to make statements like this, and to a point it's only speculation of what people actually think. Next one is about Path of Radiance Ike. I've got a couple posts here. I can't really post the whole threads, it would get way too long. The video is going to be way too long already. So first poster says, depends on who you ask, of course. I will say I've never seen anyone get as many defenders as Path of Radiance Ike. The way some people talk about him, you would think he was Sigurd, Seth, and Robin all rolled into one. And someone responds, Path of Radiance Ike is closer to Roy than he is to even the decent lords like Hector or Ephraim. I've had that take on my channel a couple times myself. I think I usually was the one saying it, but I kind of copied it from Rangor. And the interesting thing is I've kind of come back to it. The overlap is obvious, and I'll go over it in a minute. But I want to end with why some people think that he is similar to Sigurd, Seth, and Robin all into one. Ike's endgame performance is really insane. Honestly better than Roy's if you think about it, because the Ragnar's infinite uses, so you don't have to hold back on the Sword of Seals or the Binding Blade at all. You're just killing everything with the Ragnar, and he is so much better than everyone else. Roy's good with the Binding Blade, and you could argue he's better than everyone else at that point. I would argue that people that have Kanto or like staff access still have something over him, whereas Ike really has no competition for the best unit at that point. Even if you were playing the whole game with a good carry unit like Marcia, Tanith, Jill, Titania, Oscar, whoever you're gonna say, though, like the fact that they have Kanto and everything is cool, but Ike is just so freaking much better at combat in the end game, and the enemies, most of them are chumps, but some of them are so annoying that it's much better to have Ike take them out than trying to fight him with anyone else. Just having that access to that weapon. FE9 doesn't really have any other infinite use 1 or 2 range strong weapons that you can just put on another character. Like you have some strong like swords, you have the Soul Kadi, no, not the Soul Kadi, that's the Institute weapon. The Vague Kadi, excuse me. And then you have, like, you don't get the Wishblade or anything like that, so a lot of uses don't have good options. You don't have the Irvin, so Ike's weapon is just a lot better than everyone else's, but in the Binding Blade, everyone else gets like a special weapon. So that's, I think, the main difference, is Ike's finish is actually stronger than Roy's. And second of all, I do think, of course, Ike is in a game with easier enemies, so Ike feels better to use than Roy because Ike doubles more, survives more, dodges more, etc. This isn't because Ike's stats are notably much better than Roy's, though I think they somewhat are, but it's also just because the enemy stats are just lower. Roy just has worse enemies to go up against, and I think it's a little unfair to penalize Roy for this, because even though he performs worse, everyone else around him performs worse as well. So in comparison to his peers, Roy is still about the same as Ike, I would say. In some situations, I would even say he's better than Ike. For example, if you have him rapier a Cav for a bunch of damage versus Ike using the Regal Sword, Roy tends to look a little bit better. I also think Roy has a better time if he gets supports. Of course, it takes a while to get supports in FE6, but the Cav supports are relatively fast, and if you're playing FE6 slowly, which I think most people will do on their casual playthroughs, or if you just want to get through an Iron Man and you don't want to deal with awful chances to die, then getting supports on Roy is a great way to make the game a lot easier in the early game. So my first FE6 Iron Man had him just end turn spamming at the end of chapter 1 to get B supports with the Cavs as soon as possible, and then the Cavs get an A support with each other, of course, as well. And that makes Roy a lot better too, whereas Ike, no matter how slow you go, he's only going to get a C support with Oscar in like chapter, I think it's like 7 or 8. where you first unlock the base, so you get the opportunity to get C Oscar, and then it takes them a pretty long while to get like B Oscar or C Soren or something else. So that's a pretty big difference between them. I'm not sure if that shakes out to either of their advantages because the playstyles are so different, but I think that's a pretty significant difference between the two of them. And I think Ike's mid-game looks a bit better. Of course, Ike promotes a lot earlier, chapter 18 in a 27-ish chapter game, whereas Roy is promoting in chapter, well, first of all, it's like chapter 21 in a chapter 21 chapter game if you get the bad ending, but even if you assume good ending, it's still 25 chapters or so, plus or minus guidance, but there's like no guidance remaining after he promotes, so that just makes him look worse. It's also like I guess if you count guidance, it is like a chapter 28 chapter game as well, but Roy just promotes like 4 or 5 chapters later, if not more if you count the guidance. So in a lot of ways, Ike is still better off than Roy, even if you account for things like easier enemies, I think. I think part of what makes Ike look a lot better is just people enjoy his personality more. They enjoy the mercenary part more than the 7th like Prince Lord. Even though Roy has some interesting differences compared to other lords, the way the game kind of focuses on his insecurities and stuff like that, I think is generally interesting. But I think also just like FE6's story is, as much as I like it a lot more than a lot of other people do, just not as interesting and cool as Path of Radiance. I don't think there's a lot of Tellius haters out there. Tellius is much more beloved, and that bleeds over into how people rate the characters. So yeah, Ike has a better endgame performance and a lot of advantages over Roy that are tough to compete with, but the two do have a lot in common. They both are pretty weak at the start, both only really get going when they get their 1-2 range super strong sword and promotion, which is still relatively late in the game, and both of them have much better peers that are often mounted and not sword locked, and both of them kind of rely on cav effectiveness, well, Roy more so than Ike, to really do a whole lot. So I can see why this is the case. And yeah, I think the broader fandom online, like in my circles, my bubble, whatever, they're probably roughly properly rated, especially among people who play like the hardest difficulties. But people who just play the game once, they probably do think Ike's a lot better than Roy, and it's easy to see why. Next one is on Engage, and it's Diamant. It's been a long while since I've played Engage. I want to get back into it eventually, maybe do something like the 3 Houses stat race playthrough, because I think that game's a lot of room for optimization that I think could be really fun. But until I do that, I don't really want to touch it and kind of, I don't want to say spoil myself, because obviously the game is no more secrets for me, but more like I want to get into it as blindly as possible so that I can talk to my co-host and be like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And just have a different perspective conversation. I think that gets diluted a little bit if I dive into Engage now. So I'm going to be really surface level on this one. To pull from a recent entry, Diamant. He's such a mid unit where I feel he is constantly a few points short in everything. Speed, bulk, and damage, and his unique class isn't up to snuff as well. And a response, I feel like people don't think Diamant is good, it's that they want him to be good. One of the more grounded character designs with a unique class, but yeah, he mid that damn dex cap in particular. I guess they mean his dex cap is mid. Or ass, I don't know. Yeah, I thought Diamant was pretty good on my only hard mode playthrough. Another thing I haven't done in Engage is play on maddening, so that's another thing that's going to change my perspective a lot. I thought Diamant was okay, but for a lot of the game I had Ike on him, and Ike is obviously making anyone bulky and good. I do believe reading other people's discussions, like I think there was a Reddit user-made tier list, and some discussions with like the Engage channels and stuff. Generally consensus that like Diamant is okay, and probably the best way to just make Diamant good in a vacuum is just to almost instantly turn him into a Wyvern with the seals you have. Obviously there are more units that can do that, and more units that are probably going to be better at that. I've also seen people turn Diamant into a Sage and just have him be Staff Bot. Also an option, I guess, that makes him somewhat undistinguishable from someone like Alchrist, or Jade could probably do it, or someone else. There's probably some important differences between those units, but generally, if you're going to reclass people like Diamant, then in a way like that, it makes him less unique than if you keep him in his, well, unique class. Unique class I thought was okay. I believe I'm correct if I say that the dex cap is not that big of a deal, because he's going to hit it later in the game than it really matters, and what really matters is like how quickly he gets dex at first. His unique class has soul, I believe, once he promotes, which is pretty cool. It's not something you want to rely on, but you can set up like an enemy phase where enemies have to get really lucky to beat you, because not only do they have to hit you a couple times, but also they have to like not get soul procced on them, which is basically just an extra like couple points of avoid when you think about it. So I don't think the dex cap is a big deal, but I have to dive back into the meta. But I absolutely agree with the second poster that they want him to be good because he seems unique. He seems to have like good stats, even if they're not that far above the curve, if not a little bit below them. So I think this makes a lot of sense as a pick for a unit that's probably overrated. I do think when people are actually dived in, like that little layer where people are really involved with the engage meta and just comparison like personal stats and taking every resource into account, I do think most people agree that Diamant is pretty mid overall. Not bad, but not great either. Next up, we're getting into SOV, and this one is about Mage Kliff. Guy starts with 4 speed, even if he got speed level ups as a villager, and he has 1 AS with fire at base. Even with his high speed growth, he takes a while to get a respectable amount. Yet a lot of the casual fan base likes to treat Mage Kliff as the not-so-secret third deity of Valentia. Response is base take, Dreadfighter Kliff supremacy, and a response from the same poster again. I like Archer Kliff, but I'll make him anything except a mage, except for references. What Mage Kliff fan base does to a motherfucker. Yeah, I've seen this a lot. I think it's got to do with Kliff's first and last impressions. I think I've said this first in the Kanas waifu, where the most important times for a character to have a lasting impression on the player are when they join and when the game is over. This is partially why Ike is so liked, because those are the best points for him gameplay-wise as well. And it kind of goes for Kliff as well. First of all, Mage is just a really good class to be in for the first part of the game, because enemies are pretty weak, and just having 1 to 2 range and ignoring enemy terrain and just spells being decently enough and not really outclassed by weapons might-wise yet. So Mage is just a good class for all the villagers to be in. They all perform well. Even Gray, who is the worst mage in a way, in the sense that he doesn't really get anything unique, but it still turns out decently in the first part if he's a mage. And then at the end of the game, when his speed growth has kicked in, Kliff doubles a lot. He can... I've never used Kliff as a mage for the full game, fortunately, because it seems pretty painful. But I do know from experience that Kliff is, of course, got great speed growth, so he's going to double... If he's going to double anywhere consistently, it's going to be in the end game. But the middle, especially Act 3 and 4 for Alm, I think are really miserable if you have non-optimized villager builds. Mages just kind of promote late and just don't feel all that good to use. The enemy density is so high that they get like 1 hit in before they just get destroyed by a group of enemies if you don't guard them all around. And SOV map design isn't very kind to them, but that's easy to forget if you focus on his late and his early performance. Now, I think Tobin is a great mage. I think Kliff is best as a dread fighter. Of course, the villagers and SOV are weird because generally the differences between the classes are much bigger than the differences between the characters for most players. Unless you know or look up their bases and their growths and like start planning for them a little bit, it's hard to really notice a difference between making 2 different villagers the same class. And generally, a mercenary villager is going to be about as good regardless of who it is, and the same goes for any other class. So I think this is something that happens a lot with like easier Fire Emblem games, especially like Sacred Stones, where people will argue between 2 options because they tried like one thing and it worked, because the game is easy and of course what you did worked. And then you're gonna be biased towards whatever you did first or whatever you already happen to like the most. And I think that's kind of what goes on with Mage Kliff as well. It might also be a thing where people just see high growth and think, oh yeah, that's good, I'll take that. And they just don't really look critically at what the character performance at different points in the game. Instead, they just project what the 50% speed growth will make him do in the future. I don't know if that's the case here or not, but it's a possibility. Because, I don't know, I feel after I tried Merc Kliff and the actual Dreadloop strat, where you turn him into a Dread Fighter and you level him all the way to quote-unquote promote into Villager again and then make him a Bow Knight, I'm never going back. Like, that stuff is insane, and it's so much better than every other village build in the game, any other character really. It's just so broken, but you know, people don't want to see it. So here you go. I do agree that this is overrated. People who have played SOV a lot and actually take the time to argue about it online like I'm doing right now, they probably know that Mage Kliff is not the best build for him. But other than that, there's going to be a good, like a reasonable layer of people, a good faction, a good fraction of the fan base that likes Mage Kliff more than they probably would if they analyzed it more closely. I think that anyway, just my opinion. Staying in Valentia for a bit, we're talking about Palla and Leon. So to add someone that I haven't mentioned here, at least a few years ago, it seemed to be common knowledge that in Echoes, Palla was easily the best White Wing, and according to some of the best overall unit in the game. As far as I know, the people who kept playing and discussing the game might no longer agree with that, but nonetheless. I always felt like, unless you did a lot of favoritism and went through all the stat booster loops, Katria overtook her quickly and wasn't even that much worse at base. Not to mention that, at least for casual playthroughs, the non-Jessie Dread Fighters were easier to use and a lot on the and stronger on a lot of the maps than the Flyers. Leon is another best unit in the Celica army candidate, but it's less comparable. And then a quick response. I will say that with a bit of an asterisk, since I'm not super knowledgeable in the Echoes meta, but I am very certain that at least Saul read about it. From what I saw, Super Palla isn't in the meta anymore, and Leon is considered the best Celica unit. And yeah, this sentiment is correct. The players who play SOV the most nowadays still, people who have gone back to the game over and over again and analyzed it, like for example P. Vladios, who was on the SOV tier list with me, they agreed, yeah, Palla no longer considered one of the better units. And it's easy to see why Palla is appealing to people who are not optimizing the game, because she probably has one of the best starts, and her traits that make her good are easiest to appreciate, whereas someone like Leon, or even the Dread Fighters, it takes a little bit more meta knowledge to get them going, particularly the Forge. You might not even know that you can make a killer bow or get Hunter's Volley from it. So that is just something you can just entirely miss, and you're stuck with Leon and this awful accuracy and just generally kind of bad combat throughout the game. Dread Fighters are a little bit better off in that sense, because it's hard to make a Dread Fighter bad as long as you give him almost any sword, and you get a lot of good ones on the way, like the Brave Sword or Silver Sword. Those are pretty easy to make and pretty easy to consider good, so most people will like someone like Saber or even Kamui or, I don't know, the Villagers, you know? So those are usually considered good, but Palla's traits, I think they counteract something that a lot of people hate about SOV. Again, of course, giving her a Silver Lance is pretty easy, and even a Javelin, it's not that hard to figure out how to use that against enemies. And then she flies, so she can fly over the terrain that people find annoying, like the swamps and deserts and all the other things that are in your way. And that just makes Palla look a lot better. She gets a lot more combat in because she's moving like 6 tiles, 7 tiles per turn, whereas someone like Leon or Kamui or whatever is moving like 2, 3 maybe. And that just makes a big difference. That said, there are a couple big problems with Palla that haven't really been tackled a whole lot. One of them being that her good weaponry is mostly one range, so like a Silver Lance, for example, or maybe a Forged Steel or Iron, whatever your preference is. So I think you notice this most in, for example, Seath's, like Greeth's Citadel, not Seath's, Greeth. It's like a big fort, but it's pretty far away from your starting point, so most units just have to walk like 1 or 2 tiles, while Palla can just fly over there. And I was like, yeah, Palla gets there a lot sooner. I usually give a lot of credit for that in like tier lists and such. I'm like, okay, if you get there like 3-4 turns sooner, then you're pretty well off. But what I found with Palla, and even a boosted Palla, is that she can kill like the generic monsters and stuff. That's pretty easy. But if there's like a sniper around, if there's like 2 snipers around even, first of all, you're taking effective damage, which kind of sucks. At that point in SOV, enemies do carry bows that have might, which means the triple or the double effective might kind of hurts. And second of all, she doesn't counter them. So if you want to fight 2 snipers with Palla, and I know this is not optimal, but this is something she cannot do and it kind of hurts her. If there's like 2 snipers near each other, you fly up to a sniper, you try to hit them. Well, hopefully you hit and 1-round KO them, because you're taking at least 1 counterattack on the way there. God forbid you miss, and then you take an extra attack for, you know, missing them. And it's Sniper's Life for enemy phase, you have to finish them off, and they attack you again. If there's 2 snipers, the first time you fly up to them, and they get to attack you both at least once, and the more you miss, the more that happens. That's really annoying. And the same kind of goes for Cantor. She's not effective against Palla, but her resistance isn't too great. I think she even faces crit from some enemies because her luck is kind of low, and you might not have support in range to mitigate that. I forgot how support to work in SOV, but that's something I noticed with Palla. She faces low percent crits all the time. And yeah, she's effective against monsters and stuff, so you can kill those, but the non-threatening ones are pretty easy to kill anyway, and the threatening ones are pretty annoying. And as good as Palla is, she's probably not going to get the whole Citadel done before your other units get there. You're going to fight like a couple of, like, you can kill a bunch of enemies that the Cantor summon, and that's great, but eventually she's going to run into a wall and she can't really make any progress without endangering herself. And you don't want to run out of like Mila's turn-wheels, so you probably might have to fly her back and get her healed sometimes. Jenny's of course on physic duty usually for me, but she can't always heal every wound Palla has. At some point you might want to retreat with her, unite with your Dread Fighter, your Leon, your Celica, your Mages, and have them help out together. And I find that usually goes more smoothly than trying to solo like half the map with Palla. At some point she just runs into a brick wall sometimes. And when that happens, you've kind of flown forward and then gone back. And it might be good to ask yourself, what was the point of having her fly ahead anyway, if I was just going to kill a bunch of easy enemies that I could have killed later anyway? And at that point, I think it's fair to ask, does it even matter that Palla was able to move ahead of my army in the first place? Wouldn't it have been better if she was just around my army for the whole time? And so how much does her move and flight really matter in this map? And the same kind of thing comes up in the part 4 maps as well in the swamps. There's like a map with the Draco zombie summons where you have a couple snipers guard like the edge of, I guess it's some kind of fort that is in the swamp. I forgot what the map number is, but if I say like Dragon Zombie, I think you remember what map I mean. Again, in that one, you can go ahead and have Katria and Palla clear a bunch of enemies out, but they were probably the easier enemies to kill. She's also not particularly good against enemy dread fighters or sword fighters because she doesn't double them. In fact, she usually gets doubled by them, both in part 3 and in part 4. You can salvage Palla's speed a little bit with like speed dash boosters, but that will always be a bit of a problem for her. So, how does that make her worse than someone like Leon or even worse than Katria? Well, for Leon, Leon counters everything that attacks him. So if you make him good, and he kills an enemy on enemy phase, that's just a guy you don't have to deal with anymore. It's so much better to move him through the map, maybe a little slower at the time, but he kills everything in the way, than it is for Palla to move around the map, kill one-range enemies, fail to kill a sniper, fly back, get healed, come back here, have another go at it. It's just a lot more smooth to have Leon do that kind of job. So even though he moves slower, once he's been in an area, that area is devoid of enemies after he's done. You do have to watch his durability a fair bit. I'm perfectly willing to admit that he's less bulky than Palla, but the guy just has less enemies to worry about overall, like less attacks to worry about overall, because anything that attacks him is at least going to get countered, and once he has Killer Bow and Hunter's Volley unlock, he's also one-rounding. The main value of Leon isn't even that he has Hunter's Volley, it's just that he also tends to kill things on enemy phase too, once he has the Killer Bow. Like at least 50% of the time, he's just going to crit something if he has the Killer Bow. And then Katria doesn't have a great start. Palla certainly, I believe, is stronger and a bit bulkier, but Katria has more res, which makes her easy to train on a bunch of witches. For example, in the Sonia map, just give her a javelin, and any witch that she can counter, she'll just kill. Sure, witches teleport sometimes and try to kill your Atlas or your Kamui or whatever, but a lot of the time they also just move and attack Katria and then just straight up die. It's pretty easy to train her on that map, and yeah, Katria starts behind, especially on level. Palla certainly promotes earlier, but there is a point in the game where Katria promotes as well, and then just is generally what I find all around better than Palla. And how much better you think one of them is than the other is going to depend entirely on how big that time frame is when Palla can be promoted and Katria is not. I do agree that with the old meta that promoting Katria or promoting Palla early and having a Falcon Knight earlier than you're supposed to is nice for a bit, but I question how long it really lasts. I believe the main strat involves her, like, you have to backtrack after getting her to a certain level, and then you give her like 2 XP fountains and a golden apple to get the last couple levels, because those are the hardest ones to get. And I believe that gets her promoted for a good portion of the Act 3 desert maps, but I do think Katria can at least promote before Act 4 starts. At the very least, it'll be when, you know, part 4 is about to start. So the time frame for Palla to be much better than Katria is like 4 maps, 5 maps maybe. But for the other maps, I think it's arguable, especially all the maps afterwards, which tend to be longer than the Act 3 maps. So for all the maps afterwards, I think Katria is better. And I do think it's fair to at least argue that Katria is better based on that. But I can see people who think Palla is better too, especially if they think that Falcon Knights deserve resources. I do think if neither of them get resources, if you don't do what we call Super Palla, then I do think Katria is just outright better, because the time where Palla is promoted and Katria is not gets even shorter. She'll promote maybe a little bit before then, but I think I've had at least one playthrough where they both promote at the same time. And at that point, you know, the Katria's long-term benefits are just even stronger compared to Palla's short-term ones. So yeah, that's the nutshell. That's the meta in a nutshell right there. Next one is about Path of Radiance Oscar. Controversially, Path of Radiance Oscar would be my pick. By his bases and growths are kind of ass. He is not very strong, nor does he have the speed to double. Most enemies with lance weight accounted, and he's not bulky either. I don't like relying on him as an Earth Affinity dodge tank, and even if I did, I don't like depriving Ike of the plus damage from Soren support. He's got such bad unit feel. Every time I try and use him, I drop him eventually because he doesn't keep up. And then a response, Oscar falls into the Eliwick pitfall of either being a god among men, mid in every definition, or falling off harder than the average Jagan. So I'm going to get into the response real quick first. There is, I think, a tendency in the Fire Emblem fandom sometimes to ascribe this idea that I think I call sometimes the coin flip cavalier kind of syndrome, or the curse of like having mid growth with like between the 40s and 50s, where they will say, well, this unit just tends to be either really bad or really mid or really bad, or really good, I should say. So like they're all or nothing, or they're very average or something. And I don't think that makes statistical sense. I do think I discussed this with Raisins one time, and Raisins is like, I don't remember if he's a math major, but he does know a lot about probability and chances. And he said he does believe that characters with these kind of growths do have bigger deviations than a lot more, so they'll end up deviating from their averages an amount more often than most characters do. I don't think it's as significant as people experience it, I should say. I don't think it's really a thing that these characters deviate from their averages so much that people can actually experience it like this. I think this is more likely a case of confirmation bias and the fact that, especially Eliwood just has like pretty bad bases, and so he relies on growths. And I just think his bases are at a point where a couple of procs can bring him to a point where he doubles or starts doubling at some point, or starts like 2-hit killing enemies at some point, more likely than not. And I guess in a way that kind of conforms what this user is saying. They're not necessarily saying they deviate from their averages, but they are likely to start doubling or start one-rounding, but also likely not to. But I do think it's faulty to ascribe this to their average growth. What really is happening here, I think, with Oscar specifically, is that Oscar just kind of has a bad start, and it takes him a while to get going. And it might be that he suffers from the reputation that Telios Haunces are supposed to be really good, mounted units specifically. I probably am part of this problem where I would spread something like, well, I would be in some kind of tier list video, like maybe a Path of Radiance unit guide, or maybe what would you call the big tier list videos, where I get to Oscar and it's like, yeah, that's a Telios Cav, they're really good, they have high move, they have Super Canto, and they have once a range, you can forge javelins, hand axes, make them one on everything, never die because Earth Affinity support, best units, A or S tier. And on surface level, all those things are properties that you can do, but for Oscar specifically, I don't think they apply to him as much as they apply to someone like Kieran, who has a lot more strength. Oscar has some struggles one-rounding things. I mostly have mutant experience in Path of Radiance Maniac mode, where, of course, he would struggle to one-round enemy. Maniac modes, enemies are just really bulky. But even in hard mode, I do remember Oscar actually failing to one-round a lot of stuff. And specifically before he promotes, if you're not fighting a mage, you're probably not one-running it with Oscar. Like, enemies just have too much HP and a little bit too much defense to deal significant damage with him. I will say, though, his durability I don't think is overrated at all. I do think he's very tanky. In the early game, you don't really have much competition for this role. Like, if we leave out Gatri and Titania for a moment, I think he's basically up there as the most durable unit you can have. Sure, his supports aren't online. Like I said earlier, the first support he's going to have is like a C with Ike, and that's not going to get him reliable dodging. But once you get to the point where you get A Ike, which I think is before chapter 20 or so, if not earlier, that makes him and Ike effectively invincible against a lot of the enemies. You could like get him killed if you tried very hard, but most of the time, if you're at any point at all reasonable with what you expose him to, it's really hard for him to die, especially because Path of Radiance rarely does like effective weaponry against horses, and even if they do, they're only double might, so not that significant. You can even throw Soul into the mix and make him even more invincible. You probably won't need to, but that is something you can do. He has weapon triangle manipulation as well, so you're never going to be at weapon triangle's advantage against all the enemies you're facing unless you're doing it on purpose. And I don't know what this first poster means by depriving Ike of the plus damage from Soren support, because Ike can just do A Oscar, B Soren if you really want, and I don't know what else you're going to support Ike with. I think he has a Titania support, but that one is overall worse for Ike, and Titania doesn't really benefit that much from it either. So I don't know what the point of that would be. And the other thing about Soren support is it's a lot slower. You can get to C somewhat soon, but I think the B takes like so long to get that you would much rather at least start the Oscar supports if you could. And yeah, the earth dodging is just a lot. There's a lot of avoid that goes into it. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know I've frequently seen like 0 hit rates or like sub 20 hit rates on Oscar. Generally, it is true that you don't want to rely on dodging, because, you know, if you could have a unit die but they dodge instead, that's good for you, but you kind of risk the unit there. You kind of don't want to do that, as it's like not a good play. But when you have this much avoid and this much tankiness and the amount of enemies that have to get lucky just to hit you, it's a usable thing. And the great thing for Oscar, specifically in like Maniac mode, is that it protects him against both magic and physical enemies. So it universally applies to almost all groups of enemies. And it made Oscar a really good bait unit to use to just get enemies in there in my range so I could kill them on player phase. And with a unit like Oscar, he's not one-running anything unless it's a mage, so I could just give him a javelin, weaken the enemies that I want to, and kill the mages on enemy phase and then just kill the rest. Or you can give him one range and maybe one round some more bulkier enemies with like a Forged Silver or a Forged Steel depending on what he's facing. Or a Crit Forge if you're playing Maniac. And then the ranged enemies like the archers would be alive, but that's not a big deal. And yeah, I would much rather have a unit that kills everything, but those are, believe it or not, kind of rare in Path of Radiance. You have a couple like that. You have like early game Titania, and you have late game Jill or Kieran maybe. But generally, it's kind of rare to have a unit that survives everything and kills everything ever in the harder difficulties. And Oscar comes closer than most units, so I don't think he's that overrated. I think he's pretty good. He does have like big drawbacks, of course. Late game, he can't fly, which tends to hinder him in a couple of maps, like the Pitfall map and the Mountain map, and some other maps that have like moats and everything. And you can't pick up horses in this game like you can in GVA, so you can't rescue drop them around. But he can rescue drop others. He can help you have someone like Boyd or Soren keep up with the other units, or he can have Ike get to the front line sooner. He, of course, helps Ike be invincible if you want him to be. He's got a lot of use cases, and he's helpful in the early game too when you have like very few other options. And even when you get more people, he still is among like the top 5 of them. So no, I don't think Oscar is like overrated. If someone says he's like the best unit in the game, I would disagree with them. But if someone thinks Kieran is better, that's like personal preference. I'm fine with that. I don't know who you're gonna say is better than Oscar. Like, do you think Boyd is better? Do you think Lethe and Mordecai are better? Do you think Ike is better? I think the answer to all those questions is no. Next up is about Awakening again, and the answer is still Donnel. With the amount of effort you have to put into him to get him going, you can make most units good, except that they don't start out in a massive hole. And in response, Donnel has 2 huge things working against him on Lunatic. One, he is so weak that he needs constant babying in his support chapter. I'm assuming they mean the paralog that he joins in. The Sacred Stones trainees are weak but don't need that much spoon feeding. And 2, he loses his lance rank when he promotes and goes back to E rank swords or axes, depending on what he chooses, so he can't even use javelin for chip. I think this is on the money, and I think this kind of goes hand in hand with the now response earlier, that the Awakening units, they feel good when they need to, and I think there's an implicit thing the designers do where they put like a unit like Nino or Donnel into the game, and the implication of having them there is that there's a point to them. Like if they were weaker than the alternative you got a couple chapters earlier, then why would they be there? Players might ask, and then they use the unit and then they find out that he's good at some point in the game, and that's all the justification they need to keep using him. And the fact that he's enjoyable to use, of course. What I find annoying about Donnel personally, especially on like higher difficulties, is that at least with the trainees in FE8, once you spend like 1 or 2 maps getting them out of their initial stage, they tend to be fine from there. And this is honestly only really true for Ross, come to think about it. Amelia and Ewan definitely need more babying from there once they're out of their initial class. But the big thing with Donnel, especially on like Lunatic, and I think on Hard as well, is even when he's using a second seal to get out of his initial class, I think he's still weaker than most units. He does grow fairly fast from there, and I do remember like by the time he hit Paralog 2, I usually found Donnel like sufficient to do everything. And even in my casual Awakening Hard playthrough that I did a while back, Donnel just like was the only way I could get through the Inigo Paralog when I first unlocked it, forging like a massive bronze bow for him and killing everything. And that made him good enough for endgame at that point when I was at like chapter 11 or 12 or something, because I was just like insane enough to play the Inigo Paralog as soon as it unlocked. I did Crom Olivia, so it was very quickly. Not as soon as you're meant to do it, surely not. I do think E rank is a bit overrated as a problem in a game like Awakening, because forging can make an E rank weapon good enough to make it workable at least. You do lose out on options like Javelin. It sure would help if Donnel could Javelin things, but at the same time I think the Merc and Fighter trees are so good long term that it doesn't really hurt him all that much. But then again, it would be cool if he went like Paladin and kept using a lance for sure. So yeah, I mean, obviously Donnel's like one of the worst units, if not the worst unit in Awakening, but at the same time, it's perfectly understandable why there's a group of players who enjoy using him. And as for defending him online, I don't know. I like the take that Donnel seems good to players when he's actually just a really good endorsement of how good the second seal is, because a lot of units can use second seals to become really good, especially units like Robin specifically can just go into any class and kick some ass. Just having your level reset and having a whole bunch of like fast level ups with Awakening's growth is just really good. Or just getting into a more preferred class. Like second seals are just really good. Donnel is just one of the better users of them, but surely not the only one. Alright, I initially had a couple more picked out, but I don't want the video to get like super long, and maybe I can keep some in the back for a future installment. But I got one here on Florina that I want to dive into a little bit. FE7 Florina. I might be biased because I'm a Fiora and Heath enjoyer. Look at the flare. But man, Florina is kind of underwhelming to me. 5 base strength, 4 defense, and that's a 15% growth rate. I know she's a flyer and an early game 1 at that, but man, it's pretty hard to kill things with her without getting smacked in the face really hard. And then a response from a certain person with a Vike flare. I know that for discussions that include Lin mode, Florina is generally considered to get a lot of the resources there, which make her start a lot less painful. You might contest that this is unfair, and it kinda is, but it's also unfair to ignore it. This is a basis, like, way to frame it, I think. Her combat does leave something to be desired, and it's hard to ignore that, but Florina does have quite a lot of places where she can be used for great utility. Her join map is covered in terrain. She can carry people over the mountain if she wants. Next map is huge corridor, she can rescue people down. 17x, she can fly across the houses to avoid aggroing everyone, and she can even pick up promoted Hector. This can all be done without training her, so while she's frustrating to use at times, I find it hard to see her as underwhelming. A lot of overlap between her and Shanna, you know, the Psy-Op unit. I think it's totally fair to find Florina underwhelming. I think a particular experience with FE7 Pegasus Knights, especially Florina when she joins in Hector mode without any limo training, is that you can give her like several lances, like a Slim Lance, Javelin, Iron Lance, Steel Lance. It doesn't matter what you do. A line of combat against an enemy, and it just looks super, well, underwhelming. Like you're getting 2-shot. If you're trying to avoid the kind of a Javelin, your hit rate's going to be awful. Doesn't help that the joining map has a bunch of forests for enemies to be in, so when you're trying to like hit a Cavalier or something, your damage is reduced by 1 more, which is already 1 more than the Florina can afford usually. And you're usually not doubling unless you're using a Slim Lance, but then you're like 2x2 damage. Might have to take an extra counterattack. It just feels bad. It feels like more effort than it's worth. But I've also seen, there was a post recently about someone was like, wow, Florina's broken in FE7. I just had her fly over the entirety of Victory or Death and just get my boss killer to them Stella, and I just went out of there like immediately. It was so easy. It's a payoff. And it's very curious to see that some players are like so embracing units like Nino, Donnel, units that take a lot of work to get good, but they clearly enjoy the process. But then that instinct is just completely absent sometimes for a unit like Florina, or more commonly Shanna, even though I think the payoff for the Flyers is way better. Part of this is probably because a unit like Florina takes a bit more meta knowledge to appreciate, and maybe also just an enjoyment of doing things a bit quicker than in a completely casual playthrough where you're taking your time. There's not many points where saving turns in Fire Emblem actually feels satisfying. It tends to be a self-imposed challenge for the player base. Unless there's like some kind of anti-turtling incentive going on, like a thief going after treasure, a village under attack, you know, enemies are trying to overwhelm an NPC, then suddenly having more movement flying becomes more valuable. But these objectives usually don't exist early game, and if they do, your flyer usually isn't really there to help you out that much with it. What would be cool is if Fire Emblem did more things where your early game flyer can get to some objectives with maybe like rescue dropping one of your other units over there to help out. These places exist, but I find them a little rare. Like just in the games where rescue dropping exists alone, there's really not that many. And I guess they also don't want to do too many of them because the developers just want this game to be playable with permadeath. So if your flyer dies and you can't do the objective, that feels kind of bad. And 2, they might not expect people early game to be able to grasp those mechanics, but I think they could be a fun tutorial. If you look at, for example, like the earliest example I can think of for this is, say, like the limo chapter where Florina joins. She's basically the only one who can make it to the upper left village fast, so you can teach yourself how to get Florina over there to beat a brigand to the village that way. It's pretty good. The game didn't tell me how to do it, and I imagine there's a lot of people who don't even really know how to like efficiently check enemy ranges and stuff to do that safely, or they don't even know that Florina can move after visiting a village, for example, which is helpful to stay out of range. These things are a lot to learn for a new player, and another example of this is for slightly more advanced players. FE6 Chapter 4, the chapter where you fight Eric, the Laos chapter, you can reach both villages with the flyers. Probably not both in the same like playthrough as you're going very, very slow, but the flyer is by far the fastest way to get both villages, preferably the bottom one because that's the better item, but as a new player there's no way to know that, and she can do it safely as long as you just meticulously check enemy ranges. It's a good way, again, to practice this kind of thing. It's not necessary to get these villages. It's nice that like another unit can just get there too, like even a foot unit, but it's a nice way to give players more of an appreciation for flyer utility. Another more advanced example from that chapter is like when you can have Shanna drop enemies or use player units on like reinforcement points. Again, you'd have to know that these are reinforcement points, but it's a possible thing you can do that a flyer can help you with that is A, not something that only LTCers can appreciate, and B, it might actually make chapters easier for casual players. Those I think would help a lot in making people appreciate flyers a bit more, even if they have bad starts. I will say, on my first playthroughs, I found flyers early on like pretty fun to raise up. I don't remember exactly what the appeal was, but I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool to have a lot of move and go everywhere. So it's, I mean, I was bad at the game, I wasn't doing very well, but I had some fun using them. But the things that this person in the replies mentioned, like, yeah, she can fly around the houses and she can carry people over the mountains. These are not things that I think a new player will necessarily really care about. Like, they're just moving their units and trying not to die and just trying to get through the chapter eventually. What good does this do for them to get like Hector or Marcus into a forest earlier? Like, they don't really gain any real value from that. There are advantages to it, of course. Like, if you put Oswin in a forest before the Cavaliers get to your group, then Oswin can just fight the Cavaliers on his own, and that's great. So that could be an avenue for them to appreciate it, but generally don't really appreciate going faster as much as they just enjoy being safer, and that tends to be where a unit like Oswin shines a lot more than a unit like Florina, even though Florina, I think, is the better unit. Anyway, I have a lot more to say here, but actually, I have a lot more examples of posts I wanted to show, but it's getting kind of lengthy and I have like one final tangent I want to get on. So I just scrolled through the thread again just to make sure I wasn't missing it, and yeah, the thread is honestly pretty civil. Like, people are just discussing the content instead of like throwing attacks at each other or being mean or even being sarcastic to each other. Like, everyone is just like, yeah, I disagree, I agree, and I think this is a pretty good case that at least not the entire Fire Emblem fandom is toxic. I don't see like a presence of elitists or newer players being like mean to each other or being annoying about everything. There's people that I disagree with in that thread, and there's people that I just think are wrong, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's everyone to each their own, basically. So even though this thread I think had a lot of potential for toxicity, that doesn't mean that it always has to be there, and it doesn't seem to be an ever-looming presence in the Fire Emblem community. I'm not saying there is none, but I've always held the belief that at least the places I frequent, at least, haven't been so toxic, and I think more people would enjoy those places more than they enjoy, I don't know, maybe Twitter isn't very fun or something. But yeah, I think this thread is a pretty good point in the favor of the Fire Emblem subreddit as far as toxicity goes. That's all I wanted to say for today, so thank you all for watching, hope you enjoyed a chill video, and I'll see you next time.